Welcome. I'm Michelle Goode, Chief Operating Officer at Goode Intelligence, and I'm delighted to welcome Emma Butler to today's Biometrics Summit to talk about the landscape for biometrics. Emma has over 15 years of experience in privacy and data protection, including working for the UK regulator and in-house data protection officer roles. She now runs her own consultancy, Creative Privacy, offering pragmatic advice and support for privacy and data protection law compliance. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much for having me and asking me to speak on this topic.
Perhaps you'd like to share some of your thoughts on the landscape with us.
Sure. I think one of the main things about biometrics at the moment is that there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of confusion over what is and isn't biometrics. There's a lot of confusion over different sort of use cases. There's varying degrees of public acceptance and perception of the technology. And there's also an assumption that anything face-based must be biometrics, which is not the case. There's often a lot of conflating of the technology with the use cases, assuming that the technology is a bad technology used for bad things, rather than the actual use cases to which it's put and who's using the tech. And there's also a lot of different legal definitions as well, and therefore different legal obligations in different jurisdictions with regard to biometrics data. We've seen a lot of public reaction, a lot of negative public reaction in recent years against different use cases, and we've seen a lot of legislator reaction. A lot of it had been sort of just to sort of ban the use of the technology or the use of the technology in certain circumstances while they sort of figure out what the right way forward is. So I think the main thing at the moment is there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of misunderstanding, and generally the perception of biometrics is very negative by a lot of people. So I think it's important to start with looking at what is biometrics, what do we actually mean? And there's a sort of a scientific definition, if you like, and then there are lots of different legal definitions. Mm-hmm. So when you look at it sort of from a scientific point of view, and you look at dictionary definitions and kind of, I suppose, more objective definitions, sort of setting aside any particular use case or technology, then biometry is defined as being the application of statistical analysis to biological data, which is sort of very wordy and very scientific sounding. And biometrics is generally accepted, sort of definition of biometrics is that it's the measurement and statistical analysis of people's unique characteristics, be they physical or behavioural characteristics. But again, that sort of is quite a sort of scientific approach and is obviously very wide. So any measurement and any analysis of any unique characteristics is considered biometrics. But that isn't reflected in the legal definitions of biometrics in different jurisdictions. And ultimately, when you're looking to use biometrics, you're going to be bound by legal obligations rather than scientific definitions. So it's the legal obligations, the legal definitions rather, that become more relevant. So if you look at my first slide, which has a selection of definitions on it.
Just bring that up for you.
Great, thank you.
This on the slideshow. Sorry, just bear with me one moment while we just make it nice and big for everyone. Okay.
So I've looked at a selection, which are the most sort of well-known, the most sort of commonly referred to specific laws on biometrics or referencing biometrics. So GDPR, the first one in the UK and EU, has a definition of biometrics, and it's put within a broader data protection law, and it's effectively classed as being a sensitive category of data. But its definition sort of has these three prongs to it. So it talks about the specific technical processing, which is the sort of application of statistical analysis point from the scientific definition. That relates to physical, physiological, or behavioural characteristics. So far, so consistent. The thing about GDPR is it has this third prong, which is about where you are doing this technical processing to identify or authenticate an individual. So whereas the scientific definition of biometrics is kind of very wide, GDPR has actually narrowed it, and therefore it's only biometric data if you are identifying or authenticating the individual. If that's the purpose of your processing, your use of the technology, then it will be classed as biometrics under GDPR, and therefore sensitive data, and therefore everything that goes along with that. Whereas if you look at the US laws, Illinois is seen as sort of the sort of most stringent law. Washington and Texas are slightly different. At the moment, these are the three main laws in the US. There's a lot more coming and a lot more on the books, I think, and a lot of them sort of copying a lot of Illinois. They're taking Illinois law as their baseline, it looks like. Illinois has two different definitions, a biometric identifier and then biometric information, which is different from the GDPR one. And it lists quite specifically what types of things it thinks are identifiers, so face geometry, fingerprints, etc. It also has a section in it, which I haven't put in here, which lists what is not a biometric identifier. For example, it's very explicit that a photo is not. Then it has biometric information, which is about what you derive from an identifier. However, all the obligations refer both to identifiers and information. So it's not necessarily clear why we needed two different definitions, because there isn't an obligation that just applies to one and not the other. Washington is a little bit broader. It talks very generally about measurement of individual characteristics, but again, it brings in this idea of used to identify an individual, which is, as you see, is the same for Illinois. So there's this caveat that you're identifying an individual. They don't specifically talk about authentication in the definition. And then Texas is sort of much narrower in that it just has this list of things, and sort of that's it. It just goes with identifier. So even within the US legal landscape, you've got slight variation. There is some ambiguity in the law, particularly in Illinois, where it talks about sort of photos and things that aren't in the definition, but then it talks about information that is based on an identifier. And when you look at sort of things like facial recognition, you could sort of say, well, actually the use of a photo is key to facial recognition. And once you start to get into the weeds, there's actually a bit of ambiguity there, and it's not necessarily clear whether some use cases are actually covered or not. The general perception is that if you're doing anything that's sort of identifying an individual, then it's going to be caught, and there's no point trying to kind of dance around the precise wording to try and get out of it. The one thing they all have in common is that they're all clear that a photo in and of itself, standalone photo, is not included, and GDPR has the same thing in one of the recitals, so that they have in common. But obviously the whole point of biometrics is that analysis of things. So as soon as you start analysing photos, then you're likely to fall into that category. But again, the definitions are different. So one good example is age estimation. So there's technology about, and as you mentioned at the start, one of my data protection officer roles that are sort of coming to an end at the moment is for Yoti, a biometric digital identity company. And they offer an age estimation technology. And age estimation is not biometrics under GDPR, but it is biometrics under US laws. And so it's a very good example of a technology that falls into different definitions and therefore is treated differently in different laws. Which then becomes relevant if you're a company wanting to use biometrics globally, but with very different definitions and obligations in different jurisdictions. Public perception is a whole other thing. It almost sometimes doesn't matter what the legal definition is. The public perception is that anything to do with their face must be recognition, must be biometrics, and then you have a whole other challenge in explaining what you're doing to people. But when you're looking purely at legal definitions and legal obligations, there are differences, and it is very likely that what you're trying to do could be biometrics in one jurisdiction and not in another, and that's something that companies need to take into account. Moving on from that, I'm going to talk about face-based technology, because I think that's the one that's most commonly referred to. And one of the issues is that this assumption that anything face-based must be biometrics, but actually there's a whole spectrum of face-based tech. And if we look at my second slide, the Future of Privacy Forum have done a really good poster, which I thoroughly recommend, and the URL is on there to see the full poster. And this is a great resource because it really quite clearly explains many of the technologies on that spectrum that use faces and show actually how they're quite different, and they aren't all facial recognition. So you can see there they've got 5, and face detection is the one thing that people often forget, and that tends to be the basis of most face-based technology, because your first step is to understand, am I even, from the technology's point of view, am I even looking at a face? And so that kind of almost basic filtering of, is this a human face because that's what I'm supposed to be analysing, or is this, you know, a picture of a cartoon dog? That's actually quite a crucial baseline layer of technology in any face-based tech, because you want the technology to be analysing a face rather than anything else. It's also a very useful filtering tool, for example, where you have technologies that rely on individuals taking photographs of themselves, submitting their own face. Unfortunately, as with human nature, there's people who don't do that, who might send explicit images, who might send pictures of things that are not faces, you know, whether in jest or otherwise. And actually a face detection technology is a very good filtering tool that just gets rid of those. And particularly where you have human operators who are reviewing images, you're then not subjecting them to perhaps images that are going to cause them some difficulty, or sort of explicit images that it wouldn't be appropriate to expose your staff to, shall we say. So, so face detection as a basic technology is actually quite an important base layer before you start to get to any other analysis. The characterization is where we find things like age estimation. Sort of, what do I know about this face? I don't know who they are. I'm not interested in knowing who they are. I want to what does this face tell me? And that's where you get things like age estimation, gender, mood, which is one of the more controversial ones, you know, adverts in shopping centres gauging the mood of passers-by. It can also be used where you have audio descriptions. So, for example, there is a man smiling, and it may be that you know, that kind of technology is used to determine that. The unique persistent identifier is the kind of thing you might find in retail. So you want to anonymously, and I say anonymously in sort of inverted commas because you need a unique identifier. And then arguably under lots of privacy laws, it's not anonymous, but you don't really want to know who people are, but you want to be able to, for example, track footfall in the retail sector, or know which areas of your shop are most visited or least visited, if your store layout is working for you or not. So you need to have some kind of way of knowing that person A is person A and person B is person B, particularly when you're counting, but you don't actually need to know anything about them or who they are. And then you've got the verification identification options, one-to-one and one-to-many. One-to-one is it's listed on this chart as verification. It can also be called authentication. And essentially you're looking at, do these, for example, do these two images match? Are they the same person? And that's often the technology most commonly used in identity verification services, where you have an identity document, you have a picture of the individual, and the technology says, are these the same person? Is this person trying to provide somebody else's passport, for example? They can also be used for entitlement. The authentication aspect, is this person entitled to go through this door to access this building or whatever? But more often than not, you end up with the identification one-to-many when you're looking at building access control, because you necessarily need records of who's been in and out of the building, not just whether you're allowed to go through this door. And the one-to-many, again, is the one that there's most people understand by facial recognition and biometrics. It's the use cases that we've seen a lot of public reaction against, the police use of the technology in public places, where they're looking to actually identify somebody. So you know, can we find out by looking at this face who this person is? They're matching it to some kind of database of information. And again, you can look at building access control in the same way. It's obviously a much smaller, you know, specific data set of enrolled faces that are entitled to come in this building, but it's still a one-to-many match. Is this face among the list of people who I'm allowed to let through this door? That kind of thing. So this is a really good chart for showing the kind of the spectrum of face-based technology. I think it's really good at explaining how not all face-based technology is facial recognition, and it sort of shows the importance of needing to understand what we're actually talking about when we talk about biometrics, when we talk about face-based technologies. What is it that we're actually talking about? And then once we're very clear, you can start looking at pros, cons, issues, mitigating measures, etc. When you understand where on this scale you fit, rather than this assumption that it's facial recognition or there's a database of faces somewhere, which, as you can see, is just not always the case depending on the tech.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Lots of really valuable insight there, Emma. So In your opinion, tell me, what should an organisation be considering when it collects and uses biometric data?
So one of the key things is the purpose, is your use case. What are you actually trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? One of the issues we have with the negative perception of technology is that we conflate the technology and the use case. The technology is generally neutral. It's what you do with it and who you are and how you handle the data as a result of it that's absolutely key. So you need to look at how can we achieve our aims rather than jumping straight to necessarily biometrics as the obvious solution. It might not be. And I think if you look at sort of two examples of facial recognition, lots of people use technology on their mobile phones that allows them to use their face to access their phone. There's very little outcry about this. People use this quite happily. There's a lot of public acceptance of the technology, but the police using facial recognition in public places is a whole different thing. And so I think when you're looking at what you want to do as a company and you're jumping to biometrics, I think it's worthwhile taking a step back and saying, is this really necessary? Is this a proportionate way to achieve our aim? Is there another way we can do it? And I think when you look at the two examples I mentioned, that the key sort of elements are, if I use my phone's technology so that I can access it using my face, that just involves me. It's me and my phone. That's very different to use of technology in a public place where there's other people involved. It's also, my phone is kind of my device, as opposed to a company somewhere is taking a picture of me or the police are taking a picture of me. I also see an immediate direct benefit. This is clearly a security measure designed to protect access to my phone. No one else can get in my phone. That's very obvious to me. I don't need it really explaining. And it's an immediate direct benefit. If you're looking at photos being taken in shopping centres for footfall or police or whatever, it's less obvious to individuals what the benefit is, and it's less obvious what the direct benefit is to them. And rightly or wrongly, most people sort of have greater acceptance of things that they see directly benefiting them. And also there's an element of choice and control. I've chosen to activate that feature on my phone. I don't have to. I can use a PIN number. I can have no security at all. It's totally within my control and I can change my mind at any time. That's not the case when you have a technology done to you, imposed on you by a company or an organisation. So there's very sort of different factors that people take into account and factors that lead to greater acceptance of a technology. And so it's worth unpicking that for whatever it is you're proposing to do. And looking at sort of, as well as the different ways you can achieve your aim and whether actually you need biometrics and whether you can offer choices, who you are, public sector versus private sector. There's a clear difference between public sector bodies and authorities and what their job is and what they're authorised to do versus a private sector company and that kind of thing. So that makes a difference as well. So who's actually involved? What's the benefit? Is there any choice or control? Is this the right way to achieve your aim? And you might have to work harder to find a way forward where you end up in a position where you want to make something mandatory, where it's more of a sort of a public scenario where there aren't choices or controls for individuals. And then do you have specific legal obligations? What jurisdiction are you in and are the particular legal obligations? And ultimately, transparency and explanation. You know, one of the biggest issues people have is they don't understand what's happening. They don't understand what's being done with their data. They don't understand why. And so regardless of the transparency obligations you have under privacy laws, when you're doing this kind of processing of people's data, it's just common sense to be really, really clear with people about what's going on and why and what happens and what their choices, if any, are and how they can ask questions and find out more and that kind of thing. That's just crucial to kind of trust and acceptance, really. And I think one of the other things I meant to mention earlier was that as well as the actual technologies, one of the things that's increasingly important that isn't necessarily represented on that FPF chart, perhaps face characterization, you might put it in that category, is this idea of what's called an anti-spoofing measure. Is this a real live person? And particularly where you have online, the technology used online rather than in an in-person scenario. How do I know what's real? How do I know what I can trust? Is this somebody pretending to be somebody else wearing a mask? What about deepfake technology, which people are getting quite alarmed about? So there's an increasing need for that layer of technology, which is this person real? Are they who they, not just are they who they say they are, but is it a real life human? Are they trying to impersonate someone else? And that kind of layer of technology is a very important security layer that most face-based technologies are going to have to incorporate for people to be able to trust the results.
Absolutely. I think you're quite right. There's some really important things to consider. You mentioned earlier the issues of bias. Can you provide some examples of bias in biometric algorithms and why this is such a problem?
So I think there's a lot of publicly available examples we've seen over the years of technologies and algorithms being shown to be biased. There's ones in sort of recruitment, obviously police use. And the main issue is if you don't have enough representative data in the data set you're using to train the algorithm, you're going to have bias. So if you need your technology to work for everyone. If technology doesn't work for everyone, it becomes discriminatory, it widens inequalities, it reduces access for certain groups or vulnerable groups. There's a whole load of sort of publicly available studies on this. You know, they're going into way more detail than I ever could on why it's a bad thing if technology doesn't work for everyone. I think most people accept that technology, particularly face-based technology, has to work for everybody. The only way it will work for everyone is if the technology has been trained on data that represents everyone. And that is quite challenging to do, but that's why you end up with bias, because you have an over or under representation of categories or types or whatever it is that your technology is doing, particularly face-based technology in your training data set. One of the issues you sometimes come up against in privacy is a sort of a myth about data minimization. Data minimization as a principle means that it's therefore impossible to compliantly do any kind of large-scale data collection, for example, to train a data set. That's not actually true. The principle of data minimization is the minimum data necessary for your purpose. And if your purpose is to train an algorithm on a representative data set so your tech works for everybody, then by necessity you need a large pot of data to train it. So it is the minimum necessary for your purpose. It doesn't mean, you know, you can only use small volumes of data. And that's often a misunderstanding of that principle, I think, that can get in the way of proper development of these kind of technologies. And one of the things I've learned through working at Yoti from our R&D team there is that if you have too little data, then that can also present a risk. So if your algorithm is being trained on not enough data, it can almost inadvertently start to learn things that you're not trying to make it learn. And that actually that can cause risks and bias, and that actually if it has a larger data set, it doesn't make associations that it might do when the data set is too small. That's about as technical as I get, I'm afraid. The R&D people explain it much better than I can, but it was a very interesting point that actually too little data is almost a risk as well, whereas the common perception is that too much data is risky, whereas actually it can be the opposite. And I think particularly where you want to develop technology that you're making mandatory in some way, and again that comes down to the use case and to public sector versus private sector, where people don't have particular choices or controls, then it's absolutely crucial that the tech works for everyone. So it really is an issue at the moment, I think, in biometric tech, is the issue of bias, and it largely comes down to the training data sets, and if they're not representative enough, then you're going to get bias, and that really needs addressing.
As you very rightly point out, the algorithms and machine learning systems, they really do need a good amount of quality data. Do you have a view on how this can be sourced and how we can improve biometric systems in a way that's both ethical and privacy compliant?
That is definitely the million-dollar question. Basically, how do you get a reliable and representative data source? So a lot of technology has been developed using public data sets and scraping data off the internet, which has had its own legal and ethical concerns, as has been widely reported. There's also, I think, an incorrect assumption that a public data set is naturally going to be representative because it's loads of people. But actually, that's not necessarily the case. You know, if you look at where people have scraped data from, it's sort of Western companies scraping data from technology primarily used by people in Western countries. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's representative. You know, are the Finnish Suomi people represented who have quite distinct facial characteristics, for example? Are the Uyghurs in China who are potentially more distinct from other faces in that region, particularly when you talk about face-based tech here, I mean. Is it really representative? And I think a lot of the problem is a lot of this technology has sort of been developed in a very narrow, inherently biased way. And it hasn't taken a global holistic approach to looking at data that represents the globe. And I think that is a big problem with public data sets. There's an assumption, and also a lot of technology has, a lot of public data is not necessarily reliable. So I've read stories about where people have used celebrity photos that are freely available online, because celebrities tend to get photographed a lot. There's a lot of images. We tend to know how old celebrities are from their Wikipedia page, or they're sort of widely known. And for example, so where you're looking at age estimation technology is a good example. You need a face and you need an age of that face to be able to train the technology. A face is not enough. So you might think, oh, well, there's a great data source, lots of publicly available data of lots of people who are photographed regularly. It's kind of part and parcel of their job. You maybe have fewer ethical concerns. But actually, what you find is that celebrities tend to present themselves in a particular way. At the most base level, you know, a lot of them have had cosmetic surgery. Women tend to wear a lot of makeup when they're photographed out if they're celebrities, men as well. And that then can confuse the algorithm, because it's not, you know, this is not what a 35-year-old face generally looks like. This, you know, person has had surgery and they, you know, and you don't want the machine to learn that a 35-year-old person looks like this when actually it should be like this. So that isn't reliable either. So there is an issue with public data sets. Then you look at, well, okay, what about volunteers? And that's something Yoti's done a lot of, volunteer data collection activities in different countries, which overcomes a lot of the legal and ethical issues, because people are choosing to take part, having been informed about what it is and what's required of them and why this is helpful, and given options to withdraw and change their mind. But that again relies on people hearing your call for volunteers, deciding to do it. That doesn't necessarily give you as representative a data set as you would want either, which is why you then have to do a lot of it in a lot of different places, which is costly, it's time consuming, it requires a lot of human resource. So that isn't always feasible either. So it's hard to see what the right way forward is, because one of the other issues is that everybody wants the tech to work. Everybody's very concerned about bias in tech, but nobody wants to volunteer their data. It's a bit of a catch-22, you know, everybody comes to the table. This data's biased. Okay, well, would you all like to volunteer your data to help you improve it? Oh no, not mine. and then you end up back to square one. Perhaps one of the ways forward is official data sets that tend to be controlled by authorities, government, public authorities. You know, they are often very conservative, very sort of precious about their data, and for good reason. But perhaps a way forward is to start looking at whether in a given country there's any kind of official data set, particularly with regard to faces, and there being a way to work with the authority that controls that to have access for this research sort of bias mitigation purpose to generate a technology that will work for everyone and has taken account of bias and that kind of thing. That might be a way forward, but I think ultimately that's going to be one of the biggest issues is how do we solve bias? We need access to good data. How do we get access to good data? They kind of go hand in hand, and again, when there's no public trust in technology, how do you overcome that to get that public acceptance of the fact that we need more and better data to actually address these bias issues in the first place? So there's a lot of connected issues, and it isn't necessarily very straightforward. There isn't an obvious kind of way forward here, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of cooperation needed, and certainly a lot more transparency and explanation to the public to increase trust.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Emma. That's been really helpful. It's been great talking to you today. So if anybody in our audience has a question for Emma, please do contact us and we'll pass it along and get you an answer. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of Biometrics Summit 2021. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you for having me.